Okay, and so moving on, we now want to talk about something called selective incorporation. It's an important process that's associated with the Bill of Rights, and it helps to correct a misperception that a lot of people have. Something we talk about Constitution and also about federalism. And so we want to go over this process. And in going over this process, we want to talk a little bit about rights of the accused, which are talked about in this chapter as well, because a number of these rights that we know we have, or we think we know we haven't always had. And so we need to think about that. And they're particularly associated with the rights of the accused, which are really started in the 1960s. And we want to talk about how that happened. And so it's called selective incorporation. And selective incorporation is another word of saying that is it's the nationalization of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, as originally written, applied only to the national government. And so if you take a look at Amendment 1, it says, Congress shall pass no law in or religion or petition or assembly. And so it was a limitation. The entire Bill of Rights was a limitation on the powers of the national government. State governments could and did restrict a number of those individual liberties. And we're going to talk about that process where eventually the Bill of restricted state governments just as it did the national governments. But as originally written, the Bill of Rights applied only to the national government because the concern was, coming out of the Articles of Confederation, that the national government had a considerable amount of authority and that it could abuse that authority. And the view was also that states had, coming from the Articles of Confederation, had considerable amount of authority. And if they wanted to, for their state governments, to allow them to restrict freedom of speech or to restrict freedom of religion and establish a specific religion for their state, they could. They wanted to make sure the national government didn't have too much authority, but they weren't as concerned about themselves. And so the Bill of Rights talks about limitations placed on the national government, not the state governments. Things seem to change with the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The 14th Amendment came in with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. We're going to talk about that when we talk about civil rights specifically, but we want to talk now about the idea of the 14th Amendment and what it seemed to imply, and then talk about the ways in which what it seems like may not actually be what happened. And so the 14th Amendment is one of the longer amendments of the U.S. Constitution. It lays out a number of things. That after the Civil War happened, the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. But the 14th Amendment had to talk about a number of things, about how our society would differ now that slavery was no longer allowed. And so they include a number of clauses. The first is the Equal Protection Clause, that no person shall be denied equal protection under the laws. Process clause that said no person shall be denied the life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And finally, it created national citizenship. And so citizenship is something that the nation gets to provide. You are a resident of the state of California, a resident of the state of Alabama, but you are a U.S. citizen. You are a citizen of the nation, not of the state. And so there are a number of things packed within it. But one of the things we want to take a look at is if you take a look at that no person shall be denied equal protection under the laws. You could argue that the Bill of Rights are in fact the deepest kind of laws we have because they protect the individual liberties of everyone. But as written, they applied only to the national government. But once the 14th Amendment was ratified, it now said that no person shall be denied equal protection under the laws, which should imply that no state government could infringe on an individual, African American or whatever race, but the particular concern was obviously about racial segregation, is that no states could then deny the rights of these individuals. And so the Bill of Rights is seen to be the laws that we talk about the most. The supreme law of the land is the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights is part of that. Once ratified, the Bill of Rights is part of the Constitution. And so it seems as if the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment would then mean that the Bill of Rights would automatically apply to the states. In addition, when you have the Due Process Clause, it now says that no person shall be denied life without the due process of law. First and foremost, we can see now that instead of the vague notion of the Declaration of Independence, which had no legal authority in the United States and still has no legal authority in the United States, they talked about the idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But here in the 14th Amendment, they go back to the original philosophical idea of saying that an individual cannot be denied their life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And again, the idea of the process of law should be the Bill of Rights. particularly if you take a look at the Third, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Sixth, the Seventh, and Eighth Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The Third Amendment says that there won't be any soldiers placed into a house during peacetime. The Fourth Amendment says that there will not be illegal search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment says that you can't incriminate against yourself. So a case must be built against you by the government. The Sixth Amendment says there's a right to a speedy trial. The Seventh Amendment says that there are civil trials if the amount of dispute is big enough. And the Eighth Amendment says there won't be cruel and unusual punishment. And so if a person cannot be denied their life, their liberty, or their property without the due process of law, it is the Bill of Rights that is that process of law. And so it again seems as if the Bill of Rights, once ratified, the 14th Amendment, once ratified, meant the Bill of Rights would apply immediately to the states. And finally, the idea of national citizenship. If citizenship is what is important, if what it means to be a citizen of the United States is to have these individual liberties protected, then the national citizenship should mean that the 14th Amendment turned around and applied the First Amendment, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, to all of the states. But what we're going to find out when we talk specifically about this process of selective incorporation, we'll find out that there is a very important distinction between should and is. And it has a lot to do with, again, it is the U.S. Supreme Court that gets to decide what the U.S. Constitution actually says. We cannot just rely on what we think makes sense, just because it seems to be that the 14th Amendment then means that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. It took the U.S. Supreme Court to decide that actively, to say that rights now applies to each of the states in addition to the national government. But what we see is that the U.S. Supreme Court did not do this automatically. It did not happen when the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. It was not done after some arguments were held and people said, oh, now the 14th Amendment is here, the Bill of Rights now applies to the states. It is called selective incorporation. Incorporation is taking the Bill of Rights and making them apply to the states. And it is a selective process because what the U.S. Supreme Court did was said that only parts of the Bill of Rights would apply to the states, and then they would stop. And then they would hear further arguments later on down the road. And so this process of selective incorporation took well over 100 years, from 1868 until the 1960s. And as we're going to argue, even parts of it were decided just last year. And so this process of selective incorporation is a long-term one. The analogy that I heard when I was taught many years ago was the idea of thinking about selective incorporation is that the Supreme Court is the individual that holds on to a tool, and that tool is the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment does matter. That is the mechanism whereby parts of the Bill of Rights were applied to the states. But the 14th Amendment is like a sponge, and it just picks up part of, just a little bit of the Bill of Rights, and then squeezes it on top of the state capitals. And so it is a process of selective incorporation. It was not done immediately. It was not done when the 14th Amendment was ratified. It was not done immediately. Instead, it was this long-term process where selectively, over a long period of time, the U.S. Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment like a sponge and applied parts of the Bill of Rights to the states. And what I want to go on to next is to talk about that process of selective incorporation a little bit, to talk a little bit about how that actually happened. And so as an overview, we're going to talk about the ways in which they decided to do this. And one of the things you notice when you talk about this process of selective incorporation is that many of these court cases have states listed as a party to the case. So we'll have Gitlow versus New York in 1925, Neer versus Minnesota in 1931. Later on, we have D.C. versus Heller in 2008, and this year we had Timms versus Indiana of 2019. And what that is a reminder of is that what the U.S. Supreme Court says is no longer available to states. Up until that point, the states were doing it. Not every state would do it, but they had the right to do it if they wanted to. Okay, and so the very first part of the Bill of Rights that was actually incorporated was the Fifth Amendment right of eminent domain. Eminent domain is the idea that individuals have property and that the government can seize that property because that government is part of our country. But in doing so, they must give just compensation. And so it's a complicated right. So in some ways, it is better than the divine right of kings, where if a king saw your castle and liked it, they would say, I would like to have your castle. And you said, well, I worked really hard on it. I don't want to give it up. And they're like, last time I looked, I'm the king. God chose me, so I'd like your castle. So we've all seen Game of Thrones and how that works. But the idea of eminent domain is one in which the government still has the right to take your land, take your house, but at the same time, they have to give just compensation in order to do it. And so, in some way, it is a right to private property, even though some people complain about it in terms of saying the way in which it actually is being decided. Um, so that was one. It's an indication from your textbook that points out the idea that the nationalization of the economy was an important thing for um, the Supreme Court and the national government, and this is part of that. With eminent domain, you could then have railroads that would cross people's lands and would cross the country and allow the breadbasket and all the vegetables that were grown in the Central Valley of California could come back east because of the eminent domain. Gitlow versus New York of 1925 was the argument that the freedom of speech is among the fundamental personal rights and liberties protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment from the impairment of the states. And so it is this that gives support to the idea that even though the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is seen as the most important one, the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, religion, petition, assembly, and press, but in addition, the one that is first among equals, they're all equally protected because they're part of the Bill of Rights and part of the U.S. Constitution, but the first among equals is the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, because in order to have political liberty, in order to have political equality, a political liberty, to have popular sovereignty, all of those things require freedom of speech. And so the U.S. Supreme Court said that in 1925, the freedom of speech would then apply to all of the states. In 1931, they followed it up with Neer versus Minnesota, which argued that, in fact, the freedom of the press was also something that state governments would have to protect, not just the national government. And it means that, and when we talk about the media, it says that there would be no prior restraint of the press without a strong compelling harm to the government, either the state government or the U.S. government. Rights of the accused in the 1960s are ones that, a considerable set of ones where states up until that time would actually violate a number of parts of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. And we're actually going to spend a little bit of time on that in the next lecture video. We're going to talk specifically about rights of the accused. But we can see those as part of a process of see that there's some recent examples. The Second Amendment, which we argued was a complicated one to put into our mechanism of thinking about whether or not the Bill of Rights are really liberties or rights. And we argued that most of what we find in the Bill of Rights are actually civil liberties or negative rights. But we said the Second Amendment is a complicated one because of, if you take a look at, for a well-regulated militia, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed, that suggests that it would be a civil right. And that's what the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled for quite a bit of time. But in 2008, in a controversial decision in D.C. versus Heller, the five conservative majority of the U.S. Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision said that gun ownership was a civil liberty. They argued there were some limitations on that, but they weren't clear about exactly what those were. But it does say that the process of selective incorporation is continuing. And finally, just earlier this year, the 8th Amendment, not just cruel and unusual punishment, but excessive fines. The argument is the government cannot impose excessive fines. And what was argued in Timms versus Indiana of 2019 is the use of civil forfeiture was excessive fines. And so what would happen is that municipalities and state governments would do this all the time. And that if they suspected that you had drugs, if you had guns or something like that, they would seize your car. And they would often take valuables like your car that was worth more than the amount of the street value of the drugs. And so it was considered by the U.S. Supreme Court in a unanimous ruling that sort of civil forfeiture, taking away your property, even though you haven't actually been convicted of a crime. All they did was find some pot, find some heroin, find some guns. They would seize your property. And then those municipalities would use that to fund different government functions. And that was ruled unanimously as a violation of the 8th Amendment. Those were considered to be excessive fines because the amount, the value amount, the dollar amount was much larger than if you had even been convicted of the crime. Because oftentimes your property would be taken even if you weren't actually tried for the crime. It was just being suspected of the crime. And so this process of selective incorporation is one that is ongoing.